world lies silent and dark, waiting for its first dawn. In this profound stillness, a single being dares to dream of light. Yavanna, the Valor of all growing things, kneels upon the barren soil of Almaren. Her hands press deep into the cold earth, a desperate prayer for illumination taking root within her spirit. She vows to create not just a lamp, but a living source of light that will nurture every leaf, every creature, every hidden seed. This sacred ambition sets her on a collision course with the lingering shadows of a great enemy's discord and the deep skepticism of her own divine peers. By the end of our story, you will understand how this one act of creation defined the very flow of time and set the stage for an epic struggle between light and shadow that would echo for thousands of years. What happens when a single act of hope defies an entire world of darkness? And by the way, if you are comfortable sharing, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what the local time is there. It is a gentle reminder of the vast, shared landscape we all inhabit. The silence that followed her words was not empty, but heavy with the weight of a new world. Yavanna stood before Manwë, the king of the winds, and Varda, the queen of the stars, and painted a vision with her voice. She spoke not of carving light from stone or trapping it in glass, but of coaxing it forth from living sap and bark. She described two trees, majestic and organic, whose very leaves would weep liquid radiance, and whose blossoms would unfold to release a light that was alive. This was her answer to the enduring dark, a creation that would not merely push back shadows, but would breathe life into them. Yet, her grand vision was met with a profound and wary stillness. Manwë's concern was not for the beauty of the idea, but for its peril. He saw a world still wounded by the violent discord of Melkor, and he feared that such a concentration of pure, unadulterated light would become a beacon not just for hope, but for a far more terrible envy. It would be a prize too glorious and too vulnerable to exist in a world that still held malice in its deepest corners. In that moment, a chasm of purpose opened between them. Yavanna heard their caution, understood the logic of their fear, but felt the sacred imperative of her own prayer burning within her. The choice laid before her was stark, and she made it without hesitation. If her peers would not aid her, then she would walk this path alone. The potential cost was her place among the divine council. The risk was utter failure, but the reward was a living light for a world that had only known a cold, distant gleam from the stars. With a resolve that was both sorrowful and unbreakable, she turned from their counsel, and in that departure, the first seeds of her grand design were sown not in soil, but in the quiet, determined secrecy of a single heart committed to a miracle. She did not go to the majestic halls of Manwë, nor to the star-lit domes of Varda. Yavanna turned her steps instead to the deep, resonant places of the world, where the very bones of Arda hummed with a secret music. Here, in caverns lit by the glow of forges, she found All the smith. He stood amidst his anvils, his great hands shaping metal and stone, his mind forever occupied with the hidden structures of the world. The air was thick with the scent of hot iron and the rhythmic, thunderous beat of his mighty hammers. Yavanna approached not as a supplicant, but as a fellow creator, her own hands still faintly stained with the dark soil of Almaren. She spoke to him of potential, of the unformed promise sleeping within the world they both loved. She appealed to the craftsman in him, describing the two trees not as simple plants, but as living architectures of light, structures that would require a mastery as profound as his own to ever take root. She painted a picture of their intertwined radiance, a symphony of gold and silver that would be the greatest work of their age, but all his heart was heavy. He looked up from his work, his eyes, usually bright with the fire of creation, shadowed with a deep and practical dread. He saw the perfection of her vision, and all he could foresee was its destruction. He knew the mind of Melkor better than most, understood the corrosive envy that festered in the dark. To forge such beauty, he argued, was to fashion the very weapon that would be used to shatter the peace. It would be a beacon that called not to life, but to a jealous, all-consuming wrath. For a moment, it seemed the forges themselves held their breath, the silence broken only by the drip of cooling metal. Yavanna did not dismiss his fear. She stood before him, her own resolve a quiet, unshakable force. She asked him a question that would echo through the ages. Should the fear of shadow dictate what light is allowed to exist? Should the potential for malice stifle the sacred act of creation itself? To refuse to create, she insisted, was to grant the enemy a victory more complete than any he could win by force. It was to let his discord poison not just their past, but their future. Her words did not erase all his fear, but they met it with a greater power, the power of an unwavering conviction. He looked from her determined face to the dormant world outside his cavern, and he made his choice. The smith, the builder, the shaper of mountains, would now turn his skill to a living, growing thing. He laid his great hand upon her shoulder, a gesture that bound their fates to this single, perilous hope. The decision was made. In that instant, the purpose of the forges shifted. The ringing of the hammers was no longer for armor or for tools, but for the preparation of a miracle. The scale of their project escalated beyond anything yet attempted, a collaboration between the love of things that grow and the mastery of things that are made. Deep within the mountain's heart, Allah began his greatest work. The forges roared with a heat that could soften diamond, and there, upon an anvil of unbreakable stone, he started to shape the vessels. These were not simple bowls, but two colossal wells, carved to hold the very essence of light itself. He worked with a focus that silenced the very air around him, his immense power channeled into every curve, every flawless surface. The task was one of impossible precision, for the wells had to be perfect, capable of containing a radiance that was alive without corrupting it, or allowing a single drop to escape. One tremble of his hand, one flicker of his thought, and the entire endeavor could be undone. And then it happened. As he was cooling the first vessel, a hairline fracture appeared along its rim, a tiny, almost invisible flaw that spread with the sound of a dying chime. The fracture was a stark reminder that they were not working with simple matter, but with a substance meant to hold a power that defied the nature of the world itself. The physical difficulty of their task was now laid bare, a consequence of striving for a perfection that the world had never before been asked to contain. Yavanna did not cry out in dismay. She moved forward, her hands, usually reserved for coaxing life from soil, now reaching for the fractured vessel. She did not attempt to reforge it. Instead, she placed her palms upon the cold, flawed stone and poured her own vitality into the break. A soft, green-gold light flowed from her, a shimmering essence of growth and healing that seeped into the crack and fused it, not by force, but by a kind of living mending. The vessel was made whole, but the cost was a visible weariness in Yavanna's own form. This was no longer just a collaboration of skills. It was a partnership of sacrifice, revealing that the creation of this light would demand a part of their very beings. With the vessels complete, standing as perfect, silent wells in the deep dark, a new and more profound urgency filled the chamber. They had the containers, but what would fill them? The need for the ultimate source of power, the very heart of the light they dreamed of, was now upon them. Yavanna stood before the two silent wells, their perfect forms waiting in the profound dark. She drew a breath that seemed to pull from the very foundations of the world, and then she began to sing. This was no ordinary melody. It was the song of creation itself, the same ancient music that had first shaped the world from the void, now channeled through a single, unwavering will. The notes did not simply fill the air, they wove themselves into the substance of the waiting wells, a physical and spiritual exertion that made the mountain tremble. As she sang, a terrible cost became visible. The vibrant light that usually clung to her form began to dim, her strength visibly draining into the song, a direct transfer of her own inherent spirit into the empty vessels. And the void did not accept this gift quietly. A resistance gathered in the deep places, a dissonant counter-melody of ancient discord that pushed back against her tune, threatening to unravel the nascent light before it could even form. The air itself grew heavy and cold, and the flawless wells seemed to waver, as if they might shatter under the strain of this cosmic struggle. Yavanna faced a choice in that moment, a perilous escalation. She could pull back, preserving her own power, but accepting the failure of her grand design, or she could push forward, risking everything. Without a moment of hesitation, she poured more of her essence into the song, a final, desperate surge of her being. The weariness that followed was immediate and profound, a deep-seated weakness that left her visibly diminished. But from the heart of that sacrifice, a single, brilliant spark flickered within the depths of the first well. It was a tiny point of primordial light, raw and unstable, pulsing with a life of its own. The spark was alive, but it was a perilous, newborn thing, and the one who had given it life now stood vulnerable. Her own light faded, having paid a part of her eternal self to defy the enduring dark. From that single, fragile spark, life erupted in a torrent of impossible gold. The first vessel could no longer contain the burgeoning light, which shattered its stone confines not with violence, but with an overwhelming surge of growth. A magnificent shoot pierced the mountain's heart, its bark the color of molten sunlight, and it grew with a speed that was both beautiful and terrifying. This was Laurelin, the tree of gold, and as its first blossoms unfurled, they released a light that was pure, liquid warmth. Where that radiance touched the barren ground outside the mountain, the soil itself sighed with relief. Grasses sprouted in an instant, flowers burst into being with dizzying colors, and the very air hummed with the buzz of newly awakened insects. A wave of vitality, tangible and joyous, washed over the slopes of Almaren, a testament to the success of Yavanna's desperate prayer. Yet this triumph was profoundly unstable. Laurelin's light did not shine with a steady glow. It waxed and waned in a restless, unpredictable rhythm. For 7 hours, it would blaze with such intensity that the new grasses seemed to sing with life, and then, just as suddenly, its golden light would dim to a soft, drowsy gleam. In this waning, the world held its breath. The vibrant growth stuttered, the colors of the flowers seemed to fade, and a palpable anxiety settled over the land. This was not the enduring illumination Yavanna had envisioned. It was a glorious but fleeting heartbeat of creation that left the world vulnerable in the long stretches of its dimness. The very instability of the light became a new kind of conflict, a rhythm of frantic life, followed by anxious stillness. Yavanna watched this uneven pulse, her heart torn between joy for the life she had sparked and dread for its impermanence. She understood immediately that a single tree, for all its glory, could not sustain the world. Its solitary rhythm created a lopsided existence, a world of dramatic peaks and valleys. The solution was as clear as it was daunting. She had to begin work on the second tree immediately. This was no longer a choice, but a necessity forced upon her by the brilliant, flawed nature of her first creation. To achieve the balance the world needed, she would have to double her own burden, pouring what remained of her strength into another act of supreme creation. The promise was a more permanent solution, a duet of light that could fill the silences left by its partner. But as she turned back to the mountain, the brilliant, unpredictable glow of Laurelin continued to pulse, a beacon of immense power that could not help but draw attention from the far, shadowed realms where other, less benevolent eyes watched and waited. The brilliant, restless pulse of Laurelin cast long, dancing shadows as Yavanna turned back to the silent mountain and the one remaining vessel. Her own strength was already diminished, a flickering echo of its former power, yet she could not rest. The world now held its breath in the rhythmic silences of the golden light, and only a second, balancing radiance could grant it true peace. She approached the second well, her song beginning anew. But this time, the melody was different. It was not a torrent of creation, but a gentle, coaxing whisper, a lullaby meant to soothe a slumbering spirit into wakefulness. Where her first song had been a shout of defiance against the dark, this one was a reflective, patient conversation with the quiet. From this softer music, a new light began to form. It did not erupt, but condensed from the cool air itself, gathering like a mist of liquid silver. This was Telperion, and it rose with a slow, deliberate grace, its leaves dark above and silver beneath, as if it held the memory of every starlit night. Its blossoms did not blaze, but seemed to exhale a radiant dew, a cool, steady glow that settled over the land with the calm of deep thought. Yet this beautiful silver light was profoundly fragile. It required not a creator's forceful will, but a nurturer's constant, gentle attention. Yavanna found herself caught in a relentless internal conflict. She had to turn from the vigorous, demanding gold of Laurelin, which waxed with explosive life, to the delicate silver of Telperion, which needed her quiet song to simply sustain its gentle gleam. She became the heart of a delicate balance, a gardener tending two celestial fires that could not be left alone. This decision bound her to that place, making her the sole sustainer of both lights. Her constant presence was the price of their existence, and in that necessity lay a terrible vulnerability. The entire glorious system, this duet of sun and moon before their time, now depended entirely on the unwavering attention of a single wearied spirit. Any distraction, any moment of failed focus, could cause one of the lights to falter. The world now had its rhythm, a perfect rolling cycle of gold and silver, but that rhythm was a heartbeat sustained by one hand, a beautiful and precarious miracle that hung by the thread of her devotion. The first true dawn broke not with a single light, but with a perfect, silent meeting of gold and silver. As Laurelin reached the peak of its golden hour, Telperion's gentle silver was just beginning to brighten. For a single, breathtaking moment, their lights flowed together, washing the land in a radiance that was both warm and cool, vibrant and serene. This was the first day, and the dimming of one light to be replaced by the other brought the first true night. In that harmonious cycle, time itself began to flow in a measurable, predictable rhythm. The world now had a heartbeat, a regular pulse of 7 hours of gold, followed by 7 hours of silver, and the Valor named these cycles the count of time. An era of unparalleled peace settled over Valinor. Under this nurturing glow, everything flourished. Cities of unimaginable beauty were carved from pearl and crystal. Gardens bloomed with flowers that chimed softly in the breeze, and the Valor themselves walked openly in the radiance, their own forms seeming to grow more luminous. It was a golden age in the most literal sense, a period of creation and joy that seemed as if it could last forever. Yet this paradise contained a profound and troubling limitation. The light of the trees was a living, tangible force, so potent that it could not be carried beyond the encircling mountains of Valinor. It was like a precious water that evaporated if one tried to pour it into a cup and take it away. While the land immediately around the trees became a realm of everlasting spring and unimaginable beauty, the rest of the world, the vast lands of Middle-earth, remained shrouded in the dim, starlit twilight that had existed before. The very power that gave Valinor its glory also isolated it, creating a world of two halves, one bathed in celestial light, the other left to the original, gentle gloom. This division forced a momentous decision upon the Valor: to protect this fragile, perfect light, to shield it from any potential envy or corruption that might fester in the outer darkness. They chose to fortify their blessed realm. They raised great mountain walls and wove enchantments of profound power, not with malice, but with a protective love that felt, in that moment, like necessity. In doing so, however, they began to build a wall not just of stone, but of destiny. The physical separation of Valinor from Middle-earth started here, a spiritual schism born from the desire to safeguard a perfect thing, a choice that would one day have consequences for every living being across the wide world. But this perfect rhythm held its own secret beauty, a fleeting moment of magic at the turn of each cycle. As Laurelin's golden warmth began to fade and Telperion's silver gleam grew stronger, their lights did not simply pass like strangers in the night. For a few precious minutes, they flowed together, gold and silver mingling to create a soft, ethereal glow that was neither day nor night, but something entirely other. It was during these brief, transcendent periods that Varda, the Queen of the Stars, would emerge. Her work was one of immense delicacy. Using vessels forged by all, she would collect the radiant dews that wept from the blossoms of Telperion, a liquid light of incredible potency. This was no simple task of gathering morning mist. One misstep, one trembling hand, and a single drop of this concentrated essence would fall. Where it struck the earth, it did not simply glow. It seared the ground, leaving a permanent, scorched scar of pure radiance upon the soil. a stark reminder that this beautiful light was also a fundamental, untamed force. The conflict was immediate. To gather the light was to risk damaging the very world they sought to illuminate. Arda was forced to refine her technique, her movements becoming a graceful, sacred dance of precision and restraint. She learned to channel the do not into simple collection, but into a new act of creation. The excess light, the radiant spillover that was too dangerous for the earth to bear, she did not discard. Instead, she took it into the high airs, and with a thought, she scattered it. Each tiny, captured gleam became a new, distinct point of light in the vast canvas of the sky. These were the first true stars, far brighter and more constant than their predecessors. This decision was an escalation, a brilliant solution that also changed everything. Light was no longer confined solely to the trees. Now it was sprinkled across the heavens, a delicate silver dust that reached even the far, shadowed lands of Middle-earth. Yet in creating these new, lesser treasures, Arda had also populated the void with countless new points of desire, each one a tiny, perfect jewel suspended in the dark, waiting for a gaze that was not filled with wonder, but with envy. The new stars were a glittering net cast across the vault of heaven, but their light was a pale, distant thing compared to the living radiance of the trees. Far below, in the wild forests of Middle-earth, the shadows lay deep and ancient. It was into this lingering twilight that the hunter Orima rode. His great steed, Nahar, moved with a silence that belied his size, his hooves barely whispering against the mossy earth. Orima had left the perpetual spring of Valinor behind, and with every league he traveled, the world grew quieter, its colors muted, its life more secretive. Here, the ancient darkness was not an empty void, but a presence, a blanket of stillness that had settled over the land for countless years. He was a creature of immense power in a realm that had learned to live without it, and the contrast was a physical weight upon his spirit. He was searching for signs of the enemy's lingering discord, but he found something else entirely, something that would change everything. It began as a faint sound, a melody so pure and spontaneous, it seemed to be woven from the starlight itself. He reigned in Nahar, listening. The song was unlike any he had ever heard, not the planned harmonies of the Valor, but a music of discovery, of a heart finding its voice for the very first time. He followed the sound to a clearing, and there he saw them. They were tall and slender, their eyes wide with a wonder that reflected the scattered stars above. They were the Quendi, the Firstborn, the Elves. They were not hiding in fear, but simply being, their existence a quiet, beautiful answer to the long silence of the world. As he watched them, a fierce, unexpected protectiveness ignited within him. They were so new, so vulnerable, their bright spirits shining like fragile flames in the vast, dim hall of Middle-earth. He saw in their untroubled gaze a potential for joy, for art, for love that was entirely their own, a gift that had blossomed in the very shadow they called home. This protective fire in his heart immediately clashed with a cold, dawning dread. He looked from their starlit faces back toward the invisible, shielded west, toward the impossible brilliance of the two trees. The gulf was not just one of distance, but of destiny. His people, the Valor, had created a paradise and sealed it away, while these, the first children of the world, were left to navigate a twilight realm that was slowly being poisoned by the very malice they sought to escape. The conflict was clear and unbearable. How could they remain in Valinor, basking in a perfect light, while these newfound souls, so full of promise, remained exposed to every shadow that crept from the north? To do nothing was to abandon them. It was to make their own blessed realm a selfish indulgence. The choice solidified in his heart, a decision as hard and sharp as a spearhead. He would return to the Ring of Doom and plead for intervention. He would demand that the Valor act, that they either share their light or offer a shelter within it. He turned Nahar back toward the west, his mind already forming the arguments, unaware that his simple, compassionate plea was the first step onto a path that would lead to a war of gods, a flight of nations, and a sundering of the world itself. The debate that followed Ormez's return tore through the peace of Valinor like a sudden storm. In the Ring of Doom, the thoughts of the Valor were opened, and they saw the Firstborn for themselves, not as a report, but as a living vision. They witnessed the Elves singing beneath the stars, their spirits bright and untroubled, a new music in the ancient world. A fierce, protective love seized many of the Valor. They could not bear the thought of these beautiful, vulnerable beings left to face the growing shadows of Middle-earth alone. To bring them to Valinor, to shelter them under the nurturing light of the trees, seemed the only moral course. It was an act of pure compassion, a desire to wrap the children in a safety they had crafted for themselves. Yet this protective impulse was met with a deep and resonant warning. Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, whose thought flows in the deep currents of the world, spoke against the plan. His voice was not one of coldness, but of a profound understanding of nature and fate. He argued that to remove the Elves from the land of their awakening, from the starlit twilight that had shaped their first songs, would be to sever them from their own essence. The light of the trees was not a neutral gift, he cautioned. It was a power so immense it would inevitably transform them, remaking them in its own image and divorcing them from the world they were meant to inhabit and enrich. His was a fear not for their immediate safety, but for their eternal purpose. The schism was absolute. On one side lay a loving, immediate rescue. On the other, a respect for a natural destiny that risked leaving the Elves to a potential doom. Manwë, the king, listened to both sides, and the weight of the decision settled upon him. He was the vice-regent of the one, tasked with understanding the themes of the great music, and in that moment, he chose the path of protective love over the peril of natural freedom. The invitation was issued. It was a decision made with the best of intentions, a desire to shield the innocent from a terror they could not yet comprehend. But in that single, fateful choice, the destiny of the Elves was irrevocably bound to the light of the trees. They would become the Calaquendi, the Elves of the Light, forever changed by its glory, and forever marked by its eventual loss. This division between those who answered the call and those who remained in the twilight would not merely create different kindreds. It would plant a deep seed of misunderstanding and estrangement, a schism of spirit that would echo through every age of the world. The invitation from the Valor hung in the air of Middle-earth, a promise of unimaginable light that also demanded an impossible journey. For the first time, the Elves faced a choice that would define their very nature. 3 ambassadors, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë, had seen Valinor with their own eyes, and they returned as beings transformed, their spirits alight with a memory of the trees that their words could barely capture. They spoke of a land where fear was unknown and beauty was a tangible force, and their fervent belief swayed many of their people. The call to the west was not a gentle suggestion, but a clarion cry that split the elven nation at its very dawn. A great host began to gather, their hearts filled with a mingled hope and terror, for to reach that paradise, they would have to cross a dark, unmapped continent, a land of towering mountains and whispering forests, where ancient shadows still clung. This was the beginning of the great journey, a migration of spirit as much as of body. Yet for every elf who heeded the call, another listened to the familiar song of the stars and the quiet voice of the land itself, and chose to stay. These were the Avari, the unwilling, and in their refusal, the first and most profound sundering of the elven peoples took root. It was not a decision made in anger, but in a deep, unshakable love for the world of their awakening. A chasm of understanding opened between those who departed and those who remained, a divide of destiny that would never fully close. As the traveling host moved west, their progress was a flickering beacon in the vast dark. Every campfire was a gamble, every echoed footfall a potential signal. They did not know if the Valor watched their progress, or if other, hungrier eyes were drawn to their light. They were a people in motion, caught between the memory of starlight and the promise of a new sun, their unity their only shield against the perils of an unknown world. Far to the north, in the deep and echoing pits of Utumno, the birth of the two trees was felt not as a blessing, but as a searing agony. Melkor, the great enemy, perceived their living light as a poison spreading through his dominion, a direct assault on the perfect darkness he craved. And when he felt the stirring of the elves, that new, vibrant music moving westward, his wrath became a cold and focused thing. This was not merely a migration, it was a rejection of his rule, a flight toward the very light he despised. He would not allow this exodus to succeed. From the deepest crevices of his fortress, he commanded his foul servants to swarm forth. Shadows with grasping claws, spirits of mist and fear, and monstrous shapes, twisted in the earliest days of the world, began to harry the edges of the traveling host. The great journey, which had begun with songs of hope, quickly became a desperate, running battle under the cold stars. Elven campfires were now ringed with armed guards, and the beautiful melodies of their people were often cut short by a sudden, terrified cry from the darkness. The first captures were the most chilling. One moment, an elf would be walking at the edge of the column, and the next, they would be snatched away into the impenetrable gloom, their calls for help fading into a terrible silence. This was a new kind of fear, one that gnawed at the heart of their community. It was a fear not just of death, but of disappearance, of being taken to a fate so dark it could not be imagined. Orome, their mighty guide, became a whirlwind of protective fury. His great horn, the Valaroma, would sound with a note that shattered the night, and he would charge into the shadows, his presence alone enough to scatter the lesser terrors. But he was one, and the land was vast. The elven leaders, Finwë and Elwë, faced impossible choices. Do they press on quickly, risking the stragglers and the weak? Or do they slow their pace, forming a tighter, more defensible group, even though it prolongs their exposure to this relentless hunting? They learn to fight, these people of song and starlight. They fashion spears tipped with sharpened stone, and learn to move with a new, grim silence. Every league westward was now paid for in courage and vigilance. The yearning for the safety of Valinor was no longer a gentle longing, but a desperate, physical need. The promise of the light was no longer just about beauty, but about a world where a parent would not have to hold a child tight, listening for the scrape of a claw on stone in the endless night. This trial by combat forged them, hardening some with a warrior's resolve, while instilling in others a homesick sorrow for the simpler, quieter days beneath the familiar stars. The decision to build was born from a need for both sanctuary and symbol. With the perils of the journey clear and the preciousness of the elven lives now in their care, the Valar turned their gaze to the foothills of the Pelori Mountains, the natural ramparts guarding their land. There they would raise Valmir, the city of bells. This was not a slow, organic growth of a town, but a deliberate, colossal act of collective will. All as people, the masterful Noldor laid foundations of indestructible stone, while the Vanyar, with their love of light and beauty, worked alongside them, raising towers of crystal and white gold that caught the mingled lights of Laurelin and Telperion, scattering rainbows across the valley. The air was filled not with the sounds of industry, but with a kind of harmonious music, the ringing of hammers on flawless metal, and the chiming of countless silver bells that gave the city its name. This creation was a profound act of honor, a civilization building its heart in the very shadow of the miracle that gave it life. It was a fortress of light, a declaration that they would protect what they held sacred. Yet, in this very act of unity and strength, a subtle conflict took root. By concentrating their greatest works, their finest artisans, and their divine presence into this one glorious city, so close to the trees, they were centralizing their entire world. Valinor was becoming less a realm and more a citadel. Its beauty was undeniable, its peace profound, but its existence was now defined by a single, luminous point on the map. Everything of value, every source of power and artistry, was gathered here, gleaming under the two trees. This made the city a glittering bullseye in the vast darkness of the world. The very walls meant to protect them also served to highlight their greatest treasure, making its location unmistakable and its allure an unbearable provocation to any power that watched from the outer dark with envy in its heart. They had built a perfect, beautiful cage for their own paradise. This final, selfless act of creation began in silence. Yavanna stood between the two trees as their lights began to merge in that brief, magical hour of mingling. She held out her hands, not in a gesture of command, but of reception, and the very last dews of that cycle, the most potent and concentrated essence of the trees, combined radiance, gathered upon her palms like liquid jewels. This was not a resource to be used lightly, but a sacred surplus, and she felt a profound impulse to give it back to the land itself. With a weary but determined breath, she knelt and let the shimmering dews fall from her fingertips, pouring them directly into the soil at the base of the trees. The earth drank the light, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground swelled and split. From that single point of infusion, life erupted in a cascade of impossible forms. A forest of great trees, each unique and majestic, sprang towards the sky, their leaves not merely green, but shimmering with metallic hues and bearing fruits that glowed with an inner light. Enormous flowers blossomed in an instant, their petals the color of captured twilight, and their centers humming with a soft, melodic resonance. This was the birth of the great trees and flowers of Valinor, a living tapestry woven from pure light. Among them rose the golden tree of Valinor itself, a lesser echo of Laurelin, but still a source of independent, gentle radiance. The air itself grew thick with new scents and the sound of growing things, a symphony of creation that echoed the first awakening of the world. But the symphony had a cost. As the last flower unfurled its radiant petals, Yavanna sank to her knees. The vibrant light that was the core of her being had dimmed to a faint ember. She had not just used her power, she had given a part of her essence to catalyze this explosion of life, and the drain was absolute. She was left vulnerable, her strength spent, a creator hollowed out by her own generosity. The other Valar witnessed this miracle and its terrible price. Their joy at the new wonders was instantly tempered by a cold, sharp fear. They saw Yavanna's weakened state and understood a terrifying new truth. The beauty they cultivated was finite. It could be exhausted. If the one who could coax light from the void could be brought so low, then everything they had built was more fragile than they had ever dared to believe. This fear forged a swift and unanimous decision. They would not merely enjoy these new wonders, they would guard them. They would become jealous custodians, building fences of enchantment and posting vigilant sentinels around every new tree and every glowing flower. In their desire to protect the beautiful, they began to hoard it. Each new, radiant blossom was another treasure to be secured, another reason to strengthen the walls around their paradise, another glittering reason for the darkness beyond to covet what they had. In the radiant city of Tirion, a new kind of fire was kindled. The Prince Feanor was born, and from his first breath, he seemed to burn with the very essence of the trees themselves. His spirit was not merely bright, it was incandescent, a forged heat of intellect and creativity that made even the most learned of the Noldor seem to be moving in a gentle twilight. As a child, he did not slowly learn the secrets of craft. He simply understood them, as if recalling knowledge from a past life. He mastered language not by study, but by invention, creating a new tongue of such intricate beauty and logic that it felt more true than the one he had been born into. This was not mere talent, it was a fundamental force of nature given elven form. His father, King Finwë, watched this impossible son with a heart divided, a conflict that would shape the fate of his people. Immense pride swelled within him, a father's awe at a child who seemed to be the very pinnacle of their kind's potential. Yet beneath that pride, a cold, quiet unease began to grow. Feanor possessed not just genius, but a ferocious impatience with any who could not match his speed of thought. He did not share his creations, he guarded them, his bright eyes flashing with a possessiveness that was entirely new to the generous-hearted Noldor. Finwë faced a choice that no parent should have to make. Should he temper this brilliant, dangerous flame, risking the quenching of a unique light in the world, or should he indulge it, giving his son the freedom and resources his genius demanded, hoping that the goodness in his heart would eventually balance the fire? The king, perhaps blinded by love, perhaps believing that such magnificence could not possibly lead to ill, chose indulgence. He gave Feanor the finest forges, the rarest materials, his unwavering public favor. This decision was a precedent, a silent permission slip for a pride that would soon swell beyond the bounds of a single family. In nurturing a son, Finwë failed to see he was also feeding a coming wildfire, one that would one day consume the very light that had given it life. The peace of Valinor was a beautiful but brittle thing. It shattered not with a roar, but with a slow, creeping poison. The two trees themselves began to sicken. A subtle dimness would pass over Laurelin's golden leaves, and Telperion's silver blossoms sometimes wept a tarnished, oily dew. The Valar felt this malaise like a chill in their own spirits, a corruption they could not locate or fight. It was an unseen war, waged not with armies, but with a whispered discord that seeped up from the very roots of the world. Their councils grew grim, their debates echoing in a new silence. They could no longer ignore the source. The shadow had a name, and its name was Melkor. The decision to act was unanimous and terrible. They would march to the north and lay siege to Utumno, the very heart of the darkness. The war that followed was not a battle, but a resculpting of the world. Mountains were thrown down in the conflict, and seas boiled where the powers clashed. Tulkas the Strong, whose laughter had once shaken the stars, now fought with a silent, relentless fury, his great hands breaking fortress walls. In the deepest pits, they finally found him, not in a throne room of fire, but surrounded by a cold that stifled all light. His capture was the climax of an age of strife. They dragged him from his ruin, not as a conquered king, but as a prisoner of war, and bound him with a chain forged by Allah, a chain as unbreakable as the fate they now imposed upon him. His sentence was imprisonment in the halls of Mandos, a place of waiting and memory, where he would remain for 3 ages of the world, cut off from all he had sought to dominate. This was their great victory, a triumph that seemed to cleanse the very air. But victory, as it turned out, was a dangerous comfort. A deep division opened among the Valar in its aftermath. Many believed the threat was utterly vanquished. Melkor was chained, his fortress was in ruins, and his armies were scattered. They let down their guard, embracing a peace they thought was permanent. They turned their attention inward, to the healing of Valinor and the nurturing of the Elves, believing the great conflict of the ages was finally over. Yet one voice sounded a note of caution in the new silence. Tulkas, the warrior, was not so easily convinced. He remembered the cunning in Melkor's eyes, the way his malice could twist and adapt. He argued that chains could not contain a spirit so vast, that prisons were places where hatred could fester and grow stronger, not weaker. But his warnings were like stones, dropped into a deep, still pool. The others heard them, but the ripples faded quickly against the overwhelming relief of their hard-won peace. They chose to believe the danger was past. It was a critical, fatal miscalculation. While the guardians of the world slept with a false sense of security, the real war was only just beginning. For the most potent poison does not come from a sword's edge, but from a whispered word, and the most fertile ground for that whisper is a heart that believes itself to be safe. The light of the trees found its ultimate vessel in the hands of Feanor. In the deepest solitude of his forge, he worked with a concentration that blotted out the world itself. He sought not to create a mere jewel, but to capture the impossible, to imprison the living, breathing light of Laurelin and Telperion within an unbreakable cage. His material was not mere crystal, but the essence of a substance he himself had perfected, a clear, adamantine shell that could hold light without dimming it, without corrupting it. The process was an agony of focus, a spiritual exertion that mirrored Yavanna's own primordial song. When the work was finally done, 3 gems lay upon his workbench. These were the Silmarils. They did not reflect the light, they contained it. A living radiance, gold and silver, intricately braided together, pulsed within them, a captured echo of the tree's perfect harmony. The sight was so profoundly beautiful, it stole the breath from all who beheld it. A wave of awe and reverence washed over Valinor. The Valar themselves came to witness the marvel, and even they were humbled by this pinnacle of elven craft. It was a moment of supreme triumph, a testament to what their blessed realm could inspire. Yet, within Feanor's own heart, the triumph curdled instantly. The very perfection of his work ignited a terrible conflict. This light, which he had captured, now felt like a part of his own soul. The adoration of the Valar felt not like praise, but like a threat, a covetous gaze upon his most intimate possession. The love he had once felt for his people twisted into a bitter suspicion. What if they tried to take it? What if they demanded he share this ultimate expression of his genius? His pride, once a bright flame, became a smoldering, all-consuming fire. He refused all requests to hold the gems, to study them, or to allow their light to be used for any purpose other than his own private contemplation. He withdrew from the courts of Tirion, his face growing hard and his eyes guarded. This decision to hoard the light was a spiritual poison. It alienated him from the Valar, who saw his possessiveness as a rejection of their communal joy. It created a chasm between him and his own father, Finwë, who could no longer reach the son he so adored, and it sowed the first seeds of bitter discord with his half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin, who watched his isolation with a growing dread. The external threat of Melkor still lay chained in the halls of Mandos, but a new, more intimate danger was now awakening within the very heart of the blessed realm, a mirror of the shadow it sought to keep out. The most perfect things, it seemed, carried the most potent curse. The chains in the halls of Mandos could not hold his voice. Melkor, the great deceiver, learned a new craft in his confinement, one far more subtle than the forging of weapons. He did not roar his defiance, but whispered it. Through secret channels and unseen echoes, his poisoned words began to seep into the minds of the Noldor, a slow, insidious drip that eroded the very foundations of their trust. He spoke of things they already secretly feared, of the Valar's paternalistic rule, of their own constrained potential, of a world beyond the mountains where they could be kings, not just pupils. His greatest triumph, however, was his focus on Feanor. He crafted whispers that were perfect, venomous mirrors, reflecting and magnifying the smith's own deepest insecurities. The Valar did not revere your Silmarils, he hissed into the waiting silence of Feanor's heart. They covet them. They will take them from you, for they cannot abide that an elf should possess a light that rivals their own trees. They will lock your creations away, just as they have locked me away, for they fear any power they do not directly control. These lies found fertile ground in the parched soil of Feanor's pride, and they took root with terrifying speed. The conflict within him became a storm. Every glance from Manwë seemed like a calculation, every word from Alla a veiled threat. His own father, Finwë, he saw as a dupe, too trusting of these divine jailers. The most dangerous poison is the one you believe you have discovered for yourself, and Feanor was now utterly convinced of his own persecution. This internal war could not remain hidden for long. It erupted in the very streets of Tirion, when his half-brother Fingolfin, concerned for the growing rift in their family and their people, approached him with a plea for reconciliation. Feanor saw not a brother, but an agent of the Valor, a rival for their father's favor, and a threat to his treasure. In a moment of blinding rage, he drew his sword and held its point at Fingolfin's chest. The peace of Valinor, which had endured for ages, did not shatter with the roar of an army, but with the silent, terrible gleam of a blade held between brothers. That single act of violence was more destructive than any siege. It revealed that the enemy needed no army to conquer, for he had learned to turn their own hearts into his weapons. The light of the trees still shone, but a new and deeper shadow had fallen, one cast not by any absence of light, but by a heart that had chosen to believe the dark. The ring of doom was silent, a circle of stone and judgment under the shifting light of the trees. Feanor stood alone in its center, the weight of the Valor's gaze upon him, a pressure more immense than any mountain. Manwë did not rage, but his voice carried the sorrow of broken peace. He spoke of the drawn sword, of the shadow of violence that had fallen over Tirion, and he demanded an explanation for this betrayal of the sacred trust that bound all who lived in Valinor. Feanor did not deny his actions. Instead, he defended them with a cold, defiant pride that shocked the assembled powers. He spoke not of his brother, but of his rights, of the slights he had endured, of the whispers that sought to steal his legacy. He framed his rage not as a crime, but as a just defense of his own genius against a world that sought to control it. The conflict in the chamber was not one of noise, but of profound and opposing truths. Manwë saw a rebellious child who had threatened the unity of the realm. Feanor saw a jealous authority trying to break his spirit. In that moment, no understanding was possible. The king of the Valor was left with no choice but to impose a sentence. For his threat against his own kin and his disruption of the peace, Feanor was banished from Tirion for 12 years. It was a judgment meant to be just, to cool tempers and allow for reflection. But for a pride as vast as Feanor's, banishment was not a lesson. It was a public branding, a humiliation that seared deeper than any flame. He was cast out from the city he had helped make glorious, exiled from the center of his people's life. As he turned and walked from the ring of doom, he did not feel chastened. He felt like a prophet scorned by lesser minds. This legal consequence, intended to heal, instead poured poison on the wound. In the eyes of his most fervent followers, their brilliant leader had been made a martyr, punished for the very greatness that set him apart. Manwë's attempt to administer justice had, without his knowing, handed Melkor his greatest victory yet. The enemy's whispers were no longer just whispers. They now had the undeniable proof of an unjust sentence. The chasm within the house of Finwë was no longer a family matter. It was a political fault line, and the ground was beginning to shake. The sentence of banishment was a key turning in a lock, and the door it opened led straight to the one who had forged the key. Melkor, his 3 ages of imprisonment ended, now walked free in Valinor, wearing a mask of such profound and weary repentance that it fooled nearly all who saw him. He spoke softly of his errors, of the long, lonely years of reflection, and he offered his vast knowledge in service to the very people he despised. But his eyes, when they thought no one was looking, held a cold, patient hunger. He saw the simmering resentment in Feanor's exiled camp, the fractures in the house of Finwë, and the growing unease among the Noldor. He had planted the seeds of discord, and now he watched them grow, waiting for the perfect moment to harvest the coming storm. Yet he knew that whispers and lies could only weaken the fortress of Valinor. To truly shatter it, he needed a weapon of a different kind, a force of pure, unmaking hunger that could devour the very thing the Valor held most sacred. And so he went in search of the one creature whose nature was a perfect mirror of his own malice, a being of such bottomless appetite that even light was merely another form of sustenance. In the furthest, most desolate southern reaches of the world, where the light of the trees grew thin and the shadows congealed into a palpable gloom, he found her. Ungoliant was no servant, no creature of his own making. She was a mystery and a terror, a spider of colossal form who had spun her webs of night in a deep cleft of the mountains, and in her lair, not even the memory of light could survive. She did not hate the light, for hatred implies a relationship. She simply consumed it, a void given shape, an eternal, gnawing emptiness. Their meeting was not a negotiation between allies, but a recognition of shared purpose. Melkor offered her a feast beyond any she had ever known, a promise to sate the hunger that was her very essence. In return, he asked only for her power, her ability to weave webs of impenetrable darkness, and to unmake the substance of the world with her venom. Their pact was sealed not with words, but with a mutual understanding of pure, undiluted destruction. It was an alliance born not of loyalty, but of a symbiotic hatred, a hunger that would only grow the more it was fed. This decision forced a critical tactical shift. A direct assault on the Pelori and the vigilant Valor was a fool's errand. Their path had to be one of stealth and sorcery, a slinking through the unguarded passes, and a cloaking of their presence in Ungoliant's own unnatural gloom. This was the final, terrible escalation. The conflict was no longer one of poisoned words and political intrigue. It was now a physical conspiracy, a blade aimed directly at the heart of the world, poised to strike at the source of all life and hope. The fate of the light now hung on the success of a single, desperate plan, hatched in shadow by the two greatest hungers ever to stalk the world. The festival's music was a final, beautiful lie. While the Valar and Elves gathered in celebration, their vigilance lulled by a false peace, two shadows slipped through an unguarded pass in the Pelori. Ungoliant moved first, a swelling cloud of absolute blackness that drank the very air of light. She did not attack the trees with rage, but with a terrible, purposeful hunger. Her vast form ascended the mound, and with a stinger like a shard of frozen void, she pierced the living bark of Telperion. The sound was not a crack, but a deep, resonating groan, as if the world itself had been wounded. From the wound, not sap, but liquid silver light began to pour forth, and she fastened upon it, drinking the tree's very life with a dreadful, sucking silence. Then Melkor struck. His weapon was a black spear, a thing that seemed to be made of solidified hatred, and he drove it deep into the heart of Laurelin. The golden tree convulsed, its light flaring in a final, agonized burst before a river of radiant gold began to spill onto the ground, sizzling and scarring the earth where it fell. This was not a battle, it was a desecration. The few Maiar guardians stationed at the mound stood frozen, not by fear, but by sheer, overwhelming horror. The impossible was happening before their eyes. Their choice was instantaneous and brutal. To stand and fight was to die pointlessly, consumed by the same darkness that was devouring the light. Their only duty now was to become a warning. One turned and ran, her screams tearing through the festive air, a desperate human alarm bell racing toward the lights of Valmar. The Age of Bliss did not end with a slow decline, but was murdered in a single, violent act. As the last of the radiant sap was consumed, a tremor passed through both trees. Their light did not simply go out, it died. The leaves of Laurelin crumpled into blackened ash, and the blossoms of Telperion wilted into gray dust. A cold wind rose from nowhere, carrying the scent of ozone and loss, and from the east, the long shadow of Ungoliant's making began to stretch across the land, absolute and impenetrable. The world was being unmade, and in the new silence, only the sound of a satisfied hunger remained. Her scream was not a sound of grief, but of a world being torn in two. Yavanna stood before the two trees, her own life force screaming in sympathy with their final, agonized tremors. The air was thick with the scent of burnt honey and spoiled silver, a funeral incense for the murdered light. She did not hesitate. She rushed forward, her hands, which had once coaxed these very beings from the void, now pressing against their blackened, withered bark. A surge of her own green-gold vitality flowed from her, a desperate river of healing energy that had once mended the fractured stone of the wells of light. But this time, the wound was different. It was not a crack to be fused, but a void, an emptiness that drank her power without response. The conflict was absolute. Her life-giving essence met a poison that was not merely physical, but spiritual, a nihilistic hunger that had consumed the very concept of light from within. She poured more of her strength into them, her own form beginning to flicker and dim as she had during their creation, but the trees remained cold and silent. The sap that had once been liquid radiance was now a black, viscous tar. The realization did not dawn slowly. It struck her with the force of a physical blow, forcing her to her knees. Her arts, the very power of growth and renewal that had defined her since the beginning of time, were useless. They could not be saved. The silence that followed her failed effort was more terrible than her scream. From that deep well of absolute despair, a single, desperate truth surfaced. She lifted her head, her voice a raw whisper that carried to every listening Vala. There is one hope, one vessel that holds the uncorrupted pattern of this light. The light lives on, but it is imprisoned. Only the living light captured within the three Silmarils can reignite the heart of these trees. Her proclamation was not a request, but a sacred verdict. It raised the ultimate, terrible stake, transforming Feanor's greatest creations from objects of beauty into the only key to the world's salvation, placing a burden of choice upon his shoulders that no being, elf or Vala, should ever have to bear. That single, desperate hope became a command that echoed through the new dark. The Valor gathered, and before them stood Feanor, the light of his own Silmarils, now the only true illumination in the world, casting sharp, defiant shadows across his face. Yavanna, her form still faint and wearied from her failed healing, stood before him. Her plea was not one of authority, but of absolute necessity. She explained that the unmarred light held within his gems was the only memory, the only perfect pattern that could ever rekindle the life of the trees. To save the heart of Valinor, he needed only to surrender them, to allow her to break their crystalline shells and release the living radiance back into the world from which it came. In that moment, the greatest conflict of the age was no longer between light and dark, but within a single elven heart. Feanor felt the weight of it all, the love for the light that had shaped his very being, the terrible grief for the dying trees, the desperate hope in Yavanna's eyes. And he felt the other thing, the cold, hard fire of his own pride. The Silmarils were not just vessels of light, they were the ultimate expression of his own genius, a part of his very soul. To break them, even for this sacred purpose, felt like a form of self-annihilation, a surrender not just of a creation, but of his identity. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as every being present waited for his answer. Then he spoke, and his words fell like stones. He would not give them up. He declared that he would not break his own creations, even if the life of the trees depended on it. He called the Silmarils his own, his right, and he would defend that right against any power in heaven or earth, even against the one who had begged for their use. In that single, terrible refusal, the tragedy escalated from a physical loss to a spiritual fall. The Valar looked upon him, and in their gaze was a profound and final judgment. He had been given a choice to be a savior, and he had chosen instead to be a jailer. He loved the light, but he loved his possession of it more. This was the moment he was morally damned, not for a crime of violence, but for a sin of the spirit, a choice that sealed his fate and set his feet irrevocably upon a path of ruin that would drag an entire people into shadow. The darkness was no longer an absence, but a smothering presence. In the chaotic gloom that followed the tree's death, every cry of grief and shout of confusion was a perfect shield for a single, purposeful movement. Melkor did not march with an army. He moved like the shadow he was, straight to the fortified doors of Feanor's stronghold at Forminos. The defenses, once a proud symbol of Noldoran craftsmanship and independence, were now brittle. The guards were distracted, their minds reeling from the cosmic catastrophe, their eyes straining in a dark they had never known. The ultimate violation began not with a siege, but with a silent, contemptuous step across a threshold that was meant to be unbreachable. Inside, King Finwë stood alone. He had refused the summons to the festival, remaining in solidarity with his exiled son, a final, fatal act of a father's love. He was the last guardian of the Silmarils, and he faced the incarnate darkness not as a king, but as a sentinel at his son's empty treasury. There was no grand duel, no heroic last stand. Melkor's murder of Finwë was a swift, brutal act of erasure, a message written in blood that said no loyalty, no love, and no stronghold could stand against his will. The theft that followed was the true culmination of his long plan. He shattered the vaults, his hands seizing the 3 jewels whose light now flared in the absolute dark, a final, agonizing glimpse of the paradise he had just destroyed. This was more than a robbery. It was a desecration of a tomb and the looting of a soul. The consequences of Feanor's pride now lay bare in the cold reality of his father's corpse and the empty, violated casket. His refusal to yield the light had not saved it. It had painted the brightest target imaginable upon it, and upon everyone he loved. The hope for the trees was not just lost, it was stolen, locked inside the very gems he had chosen over their salvation, and now carried into the outer darkness by the being he hated most. Feanor, rushing back to Forminos through the impenetrable night, was not returning to a home, but to the physical proof of his own damnation. The sight of his father, slain and abandoned, forced him to confront the horrifying truth. His choices had not protected his creation. They had delivered it directly into the hands of the enemy and cost the life of the one who had always believed in him. This was no longer a philosophical conflict about rights and possession. The conflict was now personal, blood-soaked, and absolute. The shock of that moment extinguished the last flicker of the elf he had once been, forging in its place a lord of pure, unyielding vengeance, locking not just himself, but his entire people onto a path from which there would be no return. The new darkness now had a voice, and it was Feanor's. He stood over his father's body, the silence of the slain trees a physical weight in the air, and the fire of his rage became a cold, focused flame. He gathered his 7 sons before him, and in that black hour, he did not merely speak a vow. He forged a chain. The words of the oath were not a plea for justice, but a declaration of absolute possession, sworn upon the very name of Iluvatar, the one who had set the world in motion. They swore to pursue with vengeance and hatred unto the ends of the world any being, great or small, good or evil, who would hold or keep a Silmaril from their grasp. As the final syllable fell, a wave of palpable dread passed through every elf present. This was not a warrior's cry. It was a curse they had placed upon their own souls. The conflict was no longer a dispute with Melkor, or even with the Valor. It became eternal, a self-inflicted doom that would outlive mountains and outlast kingdoms. In that single moment, every Noldor in the shadowed square was forced to choose a side. To stand with Feanor was to bind yourself to this terrible oath, to accept a path of war without compromise. To stand against him was to be branded a traitor, an enemy of their own prince's rightful claim, the unity of their people shattered like glass. The decision each elf made in that breath of terror would define not only their own fate, but the fate of generations, setting them on a road that led first to kinslaying, and then to an endless, weary war under the cold stars of a world their own pride had helped to darken. The stakes were no longer about recovering lost light. They had escalated to a cosmic level, sealed by a curse spoken from their own lips, a poison that would ensure no hand that held a Silmaril could ever know peace again. The music of the world had fallen silent, and into that void stepped a presence that made the very air grow cold. Mandos, the doomsman of the Valor, stood before the rebellious Noldor, his form a deeper shadow in the unnatural dark. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of mountains and the finality of a closing door. He did not plead or bargain. He pronounced. He laid bare the consequences of their rebellion and the blood spilled at Alqualondeh, and he named their fate the doom of the Noldor. Their quest was cursed. Their oath would betray them. They would achieve neither the Silmarils nor the kingdom they sought, and their tears would outnumber the raindrops in the sea. This was not a threat, but a prophecy, a truth spoken from the source of fate itself. The pronouncement forced an immediate and terrible conflict within every heart. To proceed was to walk knowingly into a tragedy they had just been told was inescapable. To turn back was to admit their guilt and abandon their kin, their pride, and their sworn oath. This was the moment the host truly shattered. Finarfin, his heart broken by the kin slaying, and now chilled by this divine verdict, made his choice. He turned his face from the long road of despair and led a small, sorrowful company back toward the west to seek the pardon of the Valor. His decision was a quiet repudiation of the oath, a choice for wisdom over wrath, but Feanor and Fingolfin bound by pride and promise, pressed on. Their journey was no longer a mission of hope. It was a march into a future scripted with sorrow, a grim determination to meet a fate they now knew by name. They were exiles not just from a land, but from grace itself, and the shadow of Mandos' words stretched long before them on the icy path ahead. The path ahead was a scar of black ice and howling wind. Feanor led his people not toward hope, but away from the only home they had ever known, a self-chosen exile into a world stripped of its heart. This was the Helcaraxet, the grinding ice, a treacherous bridge of shifting flows and bottomless crevices between the lost west and the waiting shores of Middle-earth. The cold was not an absence of warmth, but an active, malevolent force that stole the breath from their lungs and turned their tears to frost on their cheeks. Every step was a battle, a desperate gamble on a sheet of ice that could shatter without warning, plunging elves and their few precious supplies into a dark, frozen sea. The light of the trees was a fading memory, and in its place, a new, brutal reality took hold. They were no longer artisans and poets in a land of perpetual spring. They became creatures of pure survival, their fine tools traded for crude ice picks, their songs of lore replaced by the grim silence of endurance. The conflict was no longer with the Valor or even with Melkor. It was a primal war against the elements, a daily, hourly struggle that demanded a terrible price. The first to fall were the elderly and the very young, their strength sapped by the relentless cold. A choice would then present itself, a moment of harrowing clarity. Do they stop to build a cairn for the fallen, expending precious energy and risking more lives, or do they press on, leaving their loved ones to the ice and the merciless sea? Each time they chose survival, a little more of their gentler nature was left behind on that frozen waste, replaced by a flinty resolve that would never fully soften. This physical trial was the anvil upon which their doom was hammered into their very souls. The grief and pride that had driven them from Valinor were now forged into a hardened, unyielding determination. They were being remade, not as the enlightened Calaquendi returning to their origins, but as a people tempered by loss and sharpened by suffering, their hearts armored in ice, as formidable as the landscape they crossed. What kind of kingdom could such a people build in a land of shadows, and what light could they possibly bring when so much of their own had been extinguished on that bitter journey? From the poisoned husks of the dead trees, a quiet, desperate magic began. Yavanna, her power nearly spent, knelt beside the corpse of Telperion, her hands trembling as they brushed the ashen bark. Beside her, Nienna, the Weeper, added her own strength, not in a song of creation, but in a lament of such profound sorrow that it held within it a final, potent love for the world that was lost. Their combined will, one of growth and one of grief, fought against the finality of the dark. It was a conflict not against an enemy, but against total extinction itself, a refusal to let the story end without a single, salvaged word. And from that shared effort, a single radiant flower bloomed on Telperion's barren branch, its petals a memory of liquid silver. Then, from the blackened stump of Laurelin, a solitary fruit swelled, glowing with a warm, defiant gold. These were not the trees reborn, but their last, dying breath given physical form, a final testament to the light that had been. the Valor now faced a choice of immense consequence. What could they possibly do with these last, precious vestiges? To leave them in Valinor was to hoard the final embers in a dead hearth. To do nothing was to let them fade, a second, quieter death. Their decision would require an act of profound escalation. They would not merely guard these relics, they would launch them into the heavens, transforming the remnants into new, celestial bodies. The craftsmen all built vast vessels to hold the last flower and the final fruit, and Varda hallowed them, imbuing them with the power to traverse the sky. The silver flower of Telperion became the moon, Isil, a cool, reflective traveler of the night. The golden fruit of Laurelin became the sun, Anor, a blazing ball of fire that would rule the day. This was a world-altering act, a new rhythm imposed upon all of Arda. Yet this new light was a mere echo of the tree's living glory. The sun's light was harsh and hot, a source of heat and growth, but it could also scorch and wither. The moon's glow was pale and remote, a borrowed light that offered little warmth. They brought time and seasons, dawn and dusk, but they also brought shadows that were sharp and defined, and a world now divided between a glaring day and a deep, star-flecked night. The creation of the sun and moon was a magnificent, desperate compromise, a victory snatched from total defeat, but it was a victory that came with the permanent understanding that the world had been diminished, and that the truest, most nurturing light was now only a legend of a lost age. The first dawn broke not with a gentle glow, but with a piercing blade of fire. From the east, Anor the sun surged into the sky, a golden vessel of such ferocious brilliance that the elves who had known only the tree's gentle radiance had to shield their eyes. This new light was not alive, it was a burning echo, and where it touched the lands of Middle-earth, it revealed a world that had been sleeping. Deep within the forests of Hildorian, the second-born stirred. The race of men opened their eyes for the very first time, not to the soft silver of starlight or the nurturing gold of Laurelin, but to the harsh, magnificent glare of a sun they had never known. They awoke into a world already ancient, a world of epic struggles and divine sorrows they could not possibly comprehend. Their first sight was a light that revealed everything, including their own profound vulnerability. This was the gift of the Valor, a desperate measure to banish the enduring shadow, but it was a gift that came with a terrible price. The light that gave men life also made them players in a cosmic drama they had not chosen. Now the hidden realms of the Elves, the secret fortresses of the dwarves, and even the dark pits where Melkor's servants festered were all laid bare under the unforgiving sun. The theater of conflict was no longer confined to Valinor or the far north. It expanded to encompass every forest, every mountain, every valley across the vast expanse of Middle-earth. The stakes of the coming war were no longer just about the fate of the Silmarils or the pride of the Noldor. They were now about the destiny of every single soul who walked under this new, harsh light. The hope of a new beginning was real, but it was a hope born in a world now permanently divided between a blazing, revealing day and a deep, star-flecked night, a rhythm that would measure out the long, weary ages of triumph and tragedy to come. The war that broke the world began not with a single battle, but with the slow, terrible march of mountains. The host of the Valor, led by Erinwe the Herald, came not as a subtle force, but as a geological event. They landed on the western shores of Middle-earth, and the ground groaned under their divine weight. This was the War of Wrath, and its purpose was not merely victory, but the complete and final unmaking of the Dark Lord Morgoth. For centuries, his iron crown had been a mockery of kingship, his fortress of Ang, and a festering wound in the north, and the stolen light of the Silmarils, a blasphemy against the memory of the trees. The Valar had remained aloof for ages, bound by their own laws and the tragic choices of the Noldor, but the suffering of the Edain, the men who had remained faithful, and the endless torment of the Elves finally forced their hand. This was an intervention on a cosmic scale, a decision to cleanse the world with a fire more purifying and terrible than any it had known. The conflict escalated beyond any prior conception of warfare. It was not fought with simple swords and courage, but with the raw elements of creation. The Valar called upon the deep seas, and tidal waves swallowed entire legions of orcs. They commanded the foundations of the earth, and volcanoes erupted in the heart of Morgoth's domain. The sky itself became a weapon, with great eagles and winged dragons locked in combat, so fierce, their falling bodies were like meteors scarring the land. The very continent of Beleriand, the stage for so many tragedies of the First Age, could not withstand this divine fury. Its plains shattered, its mountains sank, and vast stretches of land were swallowed by the relentless sea. This was the terrible cost of victory. To excise the cancer of Morgoth, the Valar had to carve away the very flesh of the world. The conflict reached its climax, not in a grand duel, but in a pit. As his armies were annihilated and his fortresses thrown down, Morgoth was dragged from the deepest vault of Angband, his power broken and his form diminished. His fate was not imprisonment, but absolute exile. He was thrust through the door of night into the timeless void, a realm of nothingness beyond the circles of the world, forever severed from the creation he had sought to corrupt. His reign of terror was over, his power to directly shape events extinguished for all time. Yet, in the eerie silence that followed the cataclysm, the survivors faced a world remade by ruin. The Elves and the Edain who had fought alongside them stood amidst the drowned kingdoms and the new, raw coastlines. The light of the Silmarils was lost, one in the earth, one in the sea, and the last burning the hand of the half-elven mariner, Arundel, as he sailed the heavens as a star. Their great enemy was gone, but so was their home. This forced upon them a final, poignant choice. Would they remain in Middle-earth, a land forever scarred by the long defeat, to build new kingdoms from the rubble? Or would they heed the call of the Valar and sail into the west, toward the undying lands of Valinor, to find a peace they had only known in legends? This decision was not just about geography, but about the nature of their own souls and the legacy they would carry into the New Age. The War of Wrath had broken the power of the First Age, but in its wake, it left a quieter, more personal war of the heart, a choice between memory and hope, between the familiar shadows of a broken world and the perilous journey toward a forgotten light. The Great War ended, but the oath of Feanor did not. His two surviving sons, Medros and Maglar, stood amidst the desolation of a broken world, their father's curse a living fire in their hearts. The Valar had recovered the two Silmarils from Morgoth's ruined crown, and the jewels now lay in the camp of Eren, the herald of Manwë. They were the last physical remnants of the light of the trees, the very essence their family had sworn to reclaim at any cost. Eren, offered them a choice, a final chance for redemption. He told them they could plead for pardon before the Valor in the west, and that the fate of the jewels would then be decided by a higher power. But the oath was a chain that would not break. To them, this was not mercy, but a new form of theft, a delay that mocked their vow and their suffering. The conflict was absolute. Their hearts were weary with centuries of war and kin-slaying, yet the cursed promise made in the first darkness screamed louder than their own remorse. They chose to fulfill their oath. In a final, desperate act, they stole into the camp and took the Silmarils by force. But the moment their hands closed around the jewels, a searing agony coursed through them. The hallowed light, pure and uncorrupted, would not suffer the touch of hands so stained by betrayal and murder. The Silmarils, which had burned Morgoth with a spiritual fire, now burned Feanor's sons with a physical one. The gems that were the ultimate prize of their existence had become instruments of their final judgment. The pain was more than physical. It was a divine rejection. Medros, in a torment beyond any he had known, could no longer bear the contradiction. He held the very light he had sought for so long, yet it was a light that condemned him. He saw no future, no kingdom, no peace, only the endless, burning truth of his own fall. In a final, terrible act of despair, he cast himself and his Silmaril into a gaping, fiery chasm in the earth. The earth, which had already swallowed so much, took this last, concentrated gleam of the trees into its molten heart. Maglar, the singer, whose soul was perhaps more sensitive to the beauty he had defiled, found his own burden unbearable. He could not destroy the jewel, but he could not keep it. Standing on a desolate shore, with the cries of gulls echoing his own grief, he took the last Silmaril and cast it far out into the rolling waves of the sea. The deep waters, which had drowned an entire continent, closed over this final, fading star. In these two acts, the last concentrated light of the trees was removed from the world of the living. They would not be reignited. They would not be wielded. One slept in the earth's core, a secret fire, and the other rested in the ocean's abyss, a forgotten dream. They became a lost glory, a memory of supreme beauty, forever intertwined with the profound failure of the pride that had sought to possess them. The world would go on under the sun and moon, but it would always be a world haunted by the ghost of a more perfect light. The age of the great trees was over, but its echo would not be silenced. In the long peace of the Second Age, the world found a new rhythm under the steady rule of the sun and moon, a borrowed light that nurtured the rising kingdoms of elves and men. Yet for those who had once walked in the radiance of Laurelin and Telperion, this new light was a constant, gentle reminder of a glory that was lost. The truest memory of that light sailed the heavens each night, a single, brilliant star on the forehead of Arend, Will the Mariner. That star was no mere celestial body, but the last Silmaril, a captured fragment of the two trees, offering hope and guidance to all who looked up from the shadowed lands below. It was a promise that even in a world forever changed, a spark of the original splendor endured, watching over the long, unfolding story of Middle-earth. Far across the sea, in the undying lands of Valinor, Yavanna walked through her everlasting gardens. The flowers still chimed, and the golden tree still cast a soft glow, but her heart carried a quiet, eternal sorrow. Her hands, which had once coaxed living light from the void, now tended to memories, The loss of the trees was not a healed wound, but a part of her very being, a testament to the profound cost of creation itself. She became the guardian of a lost era, her love for all things that grow, now tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of what had been sacrificed, and what of the world left behind. The light of the sun was harsh, yet it revealed the resilience of life. It was under this light that the Númenóreans built their mighty ships, and the elves of a region forged their rings of power. It was a different kind of hope, one born not from perfection, but from endurance. The works of elves and men were now illuminated by a light that cast sharp shadows, a light that defined their struggles and their triumphs with a stark and honest clarity. This is the final legacy of the two trees. Their story closes not with an ending, but with a transformation. The world was irrevocably shaped by their light and their loss, teaching a timeless lesson that from the deepest darkness, and even from the most profound failure, new forms of hope can stubbornly rise. The memory of that first living radiance became a guide, a standard against which all other beauty would be measured, its echo whispering through the ages that followed, a quiet, persistent call toward creation, even in the face of inevitable shadow.